Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Alchemist. Tonight, we drift back to a world of flickering candlelight, dusty manuscripts, and a man who dares to reach for the divine under a haunted sky. Picture this: the stars are hiding behind thick clouds, the trees rustle like gossiping old ladies, and a heavy silver moon hangs low, too low. Our alchemist, cloaked and hunched, steps out from his crumbling stone hut. In one hand, he carries a rusted lantern, and in the other, a leather pouch filled with secrets. You probably want to know this isn't going to end well for anyone involved, but that's the thing about greatness, it never comes cheap. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time down in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world we're all falling asleep together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fireplace was dead cold, but he didn't need warmth. He needed silence, moonlight, and madness. He had all three. He lit one candle, then another, until the room pulsed gently like a breathing beast. Each flicker reflected off iron tools, curved flasks, parchment scrawled with inks of questionable origin. Outside, the full moon leered like a pale eye through the broken shutters. Tonight wasn't chosen by chance. According to an obscure Babylonian calendar discovered in a Czech monastery, this precise lunar alignment, what some call the grave walker's moon, occurred once every 170 years. The last alchemist to attempt the stone during such a night accidentally melted his own skeleton. The hollow took that as a sign of progress. He stepped outside for one last moment of air. The trees didn't sway. The grass had stopped moving. It was as if the entire world were holding its breath. He took out a small satchel from his robe and sprinkled something black onto the threshold of the hut. It hissed as it hit the stone. Grave salt, mixed with powdered coral and nail filings from a widow. A quirky recipe from an obscure footnote in the Codex Corax, a legendary book. Some claim was written entirely while its author was upside down. With that, he returned inside and latched the door. The hollow's first task was to ignite the fire, but not with wood. No. The furnace must burn bones, old bones, whispering bones. Earlier that day he'd wandered into the graveyard with a casualness only the truly deranged or divinely protected could muster. From there he'd gathered select remains, 2 femurs, a section of pelvic bone female ideally widowed, and the radius from a child's skeleton. Legend says youthful marrow sparks the quickest flame. He laid them carefully beneath the crucible, which had been etched with runes known only to the Knights of Apollo's, a now extinct sect who believed the sun was a liquid and could be harvested. Honestly, they weren't entirely wrong. He struck flint against stone, and the fire took fast, too fast. Blue at the edges, green at the core, it roared like it had lungs. As the furnace warmed, the air in the room changed. It thickened, taking on the scent of damp coins, pine tar, and something faintly citrusy, like lemons left too long in a drawer. He began the process of purification. The lead he placed into a glass alembic, gently heating it until it softened like old cheese. He added crushed pearls, bathed in the tears of someone betrayed. He'd asked the tavern girl last week to recall her worst heartbreak and collected the drops as she wept into a drink. Yes, he tipped generously. Mercury came next, and as always, it resisted. The metal slithered like a serpent across his gloved fingers, refusing to settle. A little-known alchemical tidbit: Mercury responds better to lullabies. So the hollow sang, off-key yes, but with sincerity. Eventually it obeyed. He poured the liquid metal into the crucible. It hissed violently, not unlike a cat discovering a cucumber. The shadows in the room deepened. He whispered to himself, not a chant, not yet, but words meant to tame the energies now swirling. The room grew colder, despite the fire. A single breath escaped his lips and hovered mid-air, not rising, not falling. Outside, something shifted. He paused, ladle in hand. It was faint, a dry click, then another, like bones tapping bones, but rhythmic. Deliberate. He leaned closer to the shutter, eye squinting. The moon stared back, full and red-veined now, as if embarrassed to witness what was coming. He returned to his station, heart steady, mind sharp. Let them watch, he muttered, and the first strike came, a sharp tap of hammer against flask. Not violent, but firm, symbolic. The beginning. Outside, in the graveyard, something replied. A whisper, not in language, but in intent. Like breath drawn over old stone, the hollow smiled. It had begun. The whisper from the graveyard faded like breath on a mirror, but it left behind a taste, dry, chalky, almost metallic. The alchemist wrinkled his nose. That was new. He'd worked under strange conditions before, lunar eclipses, blood feuds, meteor showers, but never had the ground responded so quickly, encouraging, in a morbid sort of way. He turned back to the furnace. The bones were catching well, curling in on themselves with faint sighs. A sweet, acrid smoke coiled upward, tinted faintly green, and carried the unmistakable scent of wet soil and forgotten things. Perfect. Next, the forge itself had to be encased, not in brick or metal but in history. That was the trick so many got wrong. You couldn't create the Philosopher's Stone in a clean laboratory. You needed resonance, layers of old pain and wonder. So, the hollow had lined his forge with stones scavenged from the old cemetery wall. Each slab he'd hauled back by hand, dragging them through the mist like burdensome memories. Some of the stones bore faint carvings, names lost to erosion, dates only half legible. One in particular had the word mother still etched clearly across the top. The hollow had kissed that one before laying it into place. Superstition? Maybe, but historians still argue whether early alchemists truly believed emotion affected transmutation, or if it was just a poetic flourish added by later scribes. He knelt to adjust the airflow under the furnace, using a bellows made from the skin of a goat born during a thunderstorm. That detail had been difficult. But the results, supposedly, were worth it. As the heat intensified, the mercury shimmered, separating itself from impurities in thin silver threads that curled like eel tails. The lead began to take on a golden hue, not actual gold, of course, but the illusion of it. That was a good sign. Most of the great alchemists recorded similar shifts just before the first true stage of calcination, but it was the base of the furnace that held the secret. Beneath the crucible, hidden under the bones and stone, was a layer of dust, ground from human teeth. Yes, real ones. He'd bought them from a tinker who collected oddities for grieving widows. Some were baby teeth, some weren't. The alchemist didn't ask questions. He just needed the calcium. A fringe theory from an old Norse journal hinted that powdered teeth helped bind the soul to matter. It hadn't caught on, obviously, but he figured it was worth a try. Another whisper danced across the floorboards. This time, louder, not words, not yet, but a tone. A long, mournful exhale that seemed to come from the direction of the unlit corner where his old coats hung like sleeping men. The hollow glanced toward it, but didn't stop his work. "You had your chance," he said to the corner. "This one's mine." His hands moved swiftly now, decades of practice pushing away the tremble that age brought to his knuckles. He poured the partially refined mercury into a coiled glass spiral, where it would cool and clarify before joining the next mixture. The fire popped, and a single white bone burst open like popcorn. Outside, the wind picked up, only it wasn't wind. It was whispering, no longer isolated. A chorus. A mutter of voices layered over one another, some deep and dragging, others high and twitchy. They said nothing he could understand, yet the tone was clear. Watching, waiting, testing. He moved to the far shelf and retrieved a small box carved from whalebone. Inside were thin wafers of pressed herbs, each infused with sacred oils. The recipe came from a temple that had been swallowed by sand 200 years ago. A priest had shared it with him in a tavern, then died in the privy hours later. Coincidence? Maybe. He dropped 3 wafers into the crucible. The flames turned violet, and suddenly, the entire forge shuddered, not violently, just a single, unnerving twitch, like something beneath it had just shifted. For a heartbeat, the hollow's breath caught. He leaned over the crucible, inspecting the mix. The mercury spiraled and clung to the sides. The lead cracked, forming what looked uncannily like a face. He blinked. Gone. He made a note in his journal. Second phase reactive, forge alive. Not the most precise entry, but clarity could come later. Maybe. One curious thing that often goes unnoticed in alchemical texts is the importance of sound. Not just chants, but vibrations. Some theorize that the materials themselves listen, responding not just to heat or pressure, but to frequency. The hollow had long believed this. So from a wooden box beneath his workbench, he pulled out a tuning fork. It was thick, iron, and slightly bent, relic of an ancient cathedral bell tower destroyed in an earthquake. He struck it against the hearthstone. A low hum filled the room. The mercury shimmered, vibrating in sync. Outside, the whispers paused, and then laughed. It was sharp and sudden, too many voices, giggling like children, but beneath that joy was something rotten. The hollow kept the fork vibrating as he whispered a counter-frequency, a lullaby from the orphanage, where he'd spent his early years. It wasn't magical, but it reminded him of before, and the stone, if it was ever going to be real, had to remember everything. He moved carefully to the back of the room where his reference scrolls waited. Not books. He'd burned those years ago when a particularly cheeky tome tried to bite him. No, scrolls were safer, less smug. He scanned until he found the right one. Phase 2 Manifestations. It was short, probably because most alchemists never made it this far. The first line read, "If the moon watches, you may proceed." The hollow looked up, and the moon blinked. No joke. One moment, full and steady. The next, a slow, deliberate flicker, like the shutter of an eye. He exhaled slowly, not in fear, but in reverence. "You're here then," he whispered. The forge flared. The graveyard whispered again. This time, it said his name. The name spoken wasn't his birth name. No, that had been erased long ago, both from memory and from every public record he could track down. This was his soul name, the one whispered to him during a fevered ritual on the banks of the river Lethe, deep in the forest that never dried. Only 2 others had ever heard it spoken aloud. One had gone mad. The other had disappeared beneath the ice in spring. And yet tonight, from the direction of the graveyard, it emerged again. The sound curled through the cracks in the stone walls, dragged across the air like a rusty chain, and slid into his ears. Not shouted. Not spoken, murmured. As if the graves weren't surprised to see him again. He reached for his gloves, thick, leather, lined with inner symbols sewn from thread dyed with squid ink and monk's blood, another fringe belief from a 12th century apothecary's journal. The idea was that certain materials could only be manipulated by hands that carried weight. What kind of weight? The texts never specified. Grudges, maybe. With the gloves fitted snugly, he turned back to the work table. Time for the third element. Sulfur. Not from the ground, of course. That would be far too mundane. No, this sulfur had been gifted. He'd bargained for it during a market fair in the southern town of Devonport, a place notorious for its annual misfortunes and unexpectedly bald livestock. The trader, a boy no older than 10, had handed him the sealed vial and said only, "Don't use it on a Tuesday." Tonight was Thursday. Technically, he unsealed the vial. The sulfur shimmered, golden orange with hints of red, like candlelight trapped in a drop of oil. Its scent punched the air. Egg, yes, but sharper, almost like scorched parchment and burnt sugar. He added 3 precise grains to the crucible. The contents writhed, not boiled, not reacted, writhed, like something didn't want to be touched by that sulfur, and was trying to crawl out. The hollow watched, unblinking, a good sign. The materials were developing awareness. The fire pulsed violet, then briefly black, just for a blink. But it was enough to cast a shadow across the wall, and that shadow didn't match his movements. He didn't turn, not yet. He knew the rules. Make eye contact too soon, and you invited conversation. And once a shadow starts talking, well, it rarely shuts up. Instead, he reached for the mercury thread and let it drip into a cooling basin lined with powdered horn. The horn, according to old Arabic alchemical lore, was essential to channel vitality into the mixture. Historians still argue whether these writings were meant to be taken literally or symbolically, but the hollow had long stopped caring about such debates. He was in the business of results. The liquid hissed as it hit the basin, flaring briefly, then settling into a syrupy, glowing puddle, almost red. Almost. He leaned in, examining the texture. Thick, yes, vibrating, reflective, but not clearly. Faces appeared for split seconds. A child. A bearded man. A donkey for some reason. He blinked hard. Gone. He made another note. Sulfur reacted. Entities surfacing. Reflection unstable. From the corner of the room the whispering returned. But this time it wasn't external. It was inside his head. More specifically, behind his right eye. He staggered slightly, but caught himself, grabbing the edge of the table. He pressed his palm to his temple, breathing through his teeth. This part, he knew, was a test. The stone isn't made. It's revealed. He paused. That wasn't in any text. He quickly scanned the table of correspondences scribbled across his parchment scrolls. All formulas, all bindings. Nothing about revealing. Everything had always been a process. Heat, time, compression. Its hands long, clawed, and its face, blank, but somehow familiar. The hollow looked away before it noticed. At least, he hoped. He had one more element to add, before the concoction could proceed to phase 4, the catalyst. Not material, not mineral, but memory. Yes, this was the part most alchemists avoided. It was too personal, too volatile. He reached under the workbench and retrieved a small wooden box. Inside was a dried lily, faded, crumbling, bound in black ribbon. A funeral flower, from her grave. She had been the only one who ever understood his obsession. The only one who didn't flinch at the strange burns on his arms, or the sigils carved into his study door. She believed in the stone, not because it turned metals to gold, but because she thought it might heal. Imagine, she had said once, if pain could be undone. He dropped the flower into the crucible. The fire screamed. It didn't roar, it didn't flare, it screamed. A high, shivering wail that made the stone floor quiver beneath his boots. Glasses on the shelves clinked nervously. The whispering from the graveyard fell instantly silent. And then for a long breath, the world stopped. No sound, no heat. Just the sense of watching. Then the crucible cracked. Not shattered, just a hairline. Jagged split. But it pulsed red. Like something had awakened. Outside, the owl hooted for the first time in hours. And this time, the hollow finally looked it in the eye. It blinked once, then said, in a voice far too human, 3 more strikes, and the dead will walk. The hollow didn't flinch. He'd been warned that some night, the owl would speak. Old scrolls hinted at familiars who watched, not for the alchemist, but for the elements themselves, sentinels of nature's balance, occasionally breaking their silence when thresholds were crossed. The voice had been male, scratchy, somewhere between an old violin string and a dying chimney sweep, and not particularly cheerful. 3 more strikes, it had said. He rolled the words in his mind like stones in a riverbed. Each strike, what did it mean? Hammer? Intention? Phase? He made no reply to the owl. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out the red grimoire. Bound in something that looked like hide, but no animal ever catalogued. Its surface rippled faintly beneath his fingers, like the skin of a sleeping thing. There were no titles on the cover, just a symbol embossed deep into the surface, a circle pierced by a downward-pointing arrow. Interpretations of this symbol varied wildly. Some said it marked descent into self, others called it the mark of Earth's sorrow. Historians still argue whether the book was ever meant to be read at all, or merely listened to. Many who'd opened it reported hearing words before reading them. Most of them didn't live long enough to complain about it. The hollow opened it to the bookmarked page, one pressed with dried nightshade petals, black as crow feathers. The page was brittle, and the ink had bled into the parchment as though the letters were trying to escape. He read the passage aloud, slowly, deliberately. To summon the eternal red, strike thrice in blood, breath, and ash. Each awakens a gate. Each gate demands a toll. He didn't like tolls. They were rarely metaphorical. Still, he knew the first strike had already happened. The hammer's tap, that had opened something, judging by the whispers. The second would come soon. He could feel it, itching at the edges of his skull. He set the grimoire aside, and turned to the next component, the blood index. This part made most modern historians scoff, but fringe scholars, they were fascinated. According to obscure Egyptian texts, bloodlines carried chemical memory, subtle frequencies locked into the hemoglobin that remembered fear, ambition, even sin. Mixing blood from specific lineages could allegedly influence alchemical outcomes. He opened a small wooden cabinet, lined with narrow glass vials. Each was labeled by hand Cell's word. Noble bastard, executioner's daughter, unbaptized twin. He selected the last one. The blood had dried, of course, but the memory remained. With a fine brush, he painted a thin rune onto the cracked crucible. The metal twitched. Outside, a faint rustle, gravel shifting under unseen feet. A moment later, something tapped the wall. Tap, pause, tap, tap. Not a rhythm he recognized, but distinctly intentional. He ignored it. Now came the strike. He raised the ceremonial blade, dull, serrated, and blessed by no priest, but wrapped in thread from a bridal veil buried during an eclipse. He drew it across the palm of his hand, not deep, just enough to paint. He touched the bloody fingertip to the crucible's edge. The blood sizzled, blackened, and vanished. Strike 2. The shadows in the room flared wide, bending unnaturally. A deep creak echoed from beneath the floorboards. Then, unmistakably, someone whispered, "Thank you." Not him. Not anyone alive. He didn't thank them back. Instead, he retrieved a small hourglass. Its sand was lavender-colored, stolen from beneath a crypt where time itself supposedly flowed strangely. He flipped it. 30 seconds. He needed breath next. Not just any breath. He inhaled deeply and exhaled into a clay jar sealed with a wax sigil. Then he reached for a second jar. Smaller, older. Inside was the last breath of a condemned man. How he'd obtained it is a story for another night. Let's just say it involved a bribe, a storm, and a man with a morbid sense of humor. He opened both jars and let the breaths mingle above the crucible. Then, he struck the rim with the hammer again. The third strike. The room shifted. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. Physically, the floor dipped slightly. The walls grew narrower, and the air took on a thickness that suggested it now had texture, like breathing through wool. The owl let out a low, sarcastic-sounding hoot. "That's 2, it muttered, unimpressed. The hollow's ears rang, high and sharp. He stumbled back. From the crucible, a figure began to rise. Not flesh. Not spirit. Ash. A humanoid form, built entirely of soot and bone dust, began lifting itself from the mixture, slowly, crackling softly as it moved, limbs forming, a torso coalescing, no face, but an idea of one. Eyeless, mouth agape. He didn't panic. He expected this. Every record of the stone's creation, even the scattered ones translated badly from Mongolian, spoke of the Ash Witness. It always appeared between phases, always silently. Some alchemists claimed it mimicked their future self. Others said it judged their worth. It raised a hand and pointed at him. Then it lowered the hand and mimicked stirring a pot. The hollow blinked. "You want me to stir it?" The figure gave no response. It just stood there. Shrugging once, he picked up a rod and gently stirred the crucible's contents. The mixture hissed, shimmered red, and released a sigh, a sound that was unmistakably feminine. He looked back. The ash figure was gone. In its place, a single perfect feather, red. From no known bird, he retrieved it carefully and set it on the windowsill. A symbol, a marker. Strike 2. Gate 2. Outside. The graveyard moaned again. Not individual whispers now, but a hum, unified. Like a choir, rehearsing a dirge it hadn't sung in centuries. The owl ruffled its feathers. "They're getting chatty," it said. "Hope you've brought snacks." The hollow chuckled once, dry and brief. Almost done. One strike remained, and the grave dirt had begun to breathe. The grave dirt didn't move so much as it inhaled. A long, slow breath, quiet enough that you might think it was just your imagination. If you hadn't seen the way the loose soil near the gate drew inward like lungs filling with air, and when the hollow saw that subtle shift, he didn't blink. He only adjusted the wick on his lamp to burn a touch brighter. It wouldn't stop what was coming, of course. But no reason to let them sneak up on him in the dark. He returned to the crucible. It had settled. The surface was smooth now, glassy and red, like cooling magma. The smell had changed too. Less sulfur, more iron, blood, but not his. That's when the whispers started again. Not outside this time. Inside. They crept around the edges of his thoughts like mice beneath floorboards, quiet, but too deliberate to ignore. They didn't form full sentences. Not yet, just snippets. A name here, a sorrow there. He caught words like why, and again, and debt. One voice, disturbingly cheerful, just repeated, "It's your turn now," in a sing-song lilt, like a nursery rhyme. He ignored them. Not because he was brave, but because he'd trained for this. Years ago in a monastery deep in the Pyrenees, he had endured the silencing chamber, a box no larger than a coffin, carved into stone, where monks sat for 9 days straight in total darkness, while visions of their past clawed for attention. Only those who didn't scream by dawn of the third day were allowed to study the forbidden scrolls. He made it to day 8, before the visions stopped bothering. So no, whispers were nothing new. He reached beneath the table, and pulled out a copper mirror. Ancient, cracked, tarnished to the point of uselessness, except for its purpose. This was not for vanity. It was for warning. The mirror, according to a fringe Venetian text, had once belonged to a cardinal who used it to reflect the sins of the congregation directly back onto their souls. Whatever that meant, the Hollow had found it to be reactive. He angled it toward the crucible. At first, nothing. Then the mirror twitched, a single ripple across the surface, and then the reflection changed. It no longer showed the forge. It showed a graveyard. His graveyard. And something moving through it. Not walking. Slithering. No. Dragging. As if its own body were too heavy, or perhaps stitched together in pieces that hadn't yet agreed to cooperate. The shape paused near the crooked tomb of Sister Dorline, the grave that had split in half during the last lunar eclipse, and then it looked up. At him. Through the mirror. The Hollow slowly turned the mirror away. He wasn't going to give that thing eye contact. Not yet. He set the mirror down, took a breath, then turned toward the window. The owl was still there, but now so was another. Smaller, scruffier. Its feathers stuck out in odd directions, like it had been pulled through a hedge backwards. It stared directly at the Hollow and said, in a voice uncannily like a disappointed librarian, "You should hurry." He arched a brow. They sent a backup. The larger owl shrugged. If owls can shrug. Union rules. The Hollow turned back to the forge. It was time for the final element. Not sulfur, not lead, not blood, but memory, not the kind you write down or lock away. The kind that bites. He took out a vial filled with a pale blue liquid. It shimmered faintly, like moonlight trapped in oil. This was his own memory, distilled, extracted from the base of the skull using a method he'd developed after reading an obscure side note in a Persian scroll, one that most scholars thought was metaphorical. It wasn't. This particular memory was her name. He'd removed it a decade ago, sealed it, and never spoken it since. But to finish the process, to make the Philosopher's Stone, the memory had to re-enter the crucible, not just to flavor it, but to bind it. The stone didn't form without sacrifice, and names were the oldest currency. He unsealed the vial. Instantly, the air grew warm, not furnace warm, alive warm, like a heartbeat next to your skin. He poured the memory in. The crucible flared bright gold, then dimmed, then pulsed red. It was ready. Only one step remained. He lifted the hammer. Not the ceremonial one. That one had served its purpose. No, this was different. Heavier, forged from melted shackles found in an abandoned prison. Its handle was wrapped in parchment from a royal decree that had once sentenced 7 alchemists to death for delusions of grandeur. Poetic, really. He raised the hammer high, and struck, the third strike. Not groaning, just humming, low and deep and filled with recognition. The stone was forming. He could see it now within the crucible. Something round, solid, no larger than a peach. Glowing red, not fiery but internal, like a sleeping heart under skin. But with the strike came cost. His hand shook. His vision blurred, and the crucible cracked further. From the edges, tiny threads of darkness crept out. Not shadow, something thicker, oily, curious. He backed away slowly. Outside, the graveyard grew silent again, but not empty. Now, footsteps, soft, dragging, not in a hurry, just determined. The Hollow turned to the window, and one by one shadows rose from the earth. The first shadow stood just beyond the crooked iron gate, still half buried in bramble and grave moss. It didn't move, but it pulsed faintly, as if breathing without lungs. Behind it, others rose. Tall, short, stooped, straight. Some shimmered like heat over a desert road. Others were denser, darker, more certain of their return. They didn't look like people. Not anymore. Time had robbed them of edges. Faces were hinted at, not drawn. Hands hung too long, or not at all. One figure appeared to have antlers, but whether those were a crown or a leftover root system, the Hollow couldn't say. He stepped back from the window. Inside the forge, the Philosopher's Stone pulsed again, brighter now. Its color deepened from red to crimson to something darker, a shade that had no name but was felt instinctively, like fear in your bones or the moment before lightning strikes. The Hollow turned toward the crucible. Its edges were blackened. The third crack spread now, thin as a hairline fracture in glass, but wide enough to let something else peek through. He didn't stop it. He couldn't. Every record, every lost page and frantic final note in the annals of alchemy spoke of this moment. when the boundary between matter and meaning thinned. When the stone, no longer just an object, began to listen. And apparently it wanted to meet the neighbors. From the graveyard, a whisper, this one more articulate than the others. "You've brought us home." He didn't answer. The man's face had been carved with symbols, some of them glowing faintly beneath his skin. He'd said, "When the dead start remembering who they were, use this. It doesn't stop them. It only reminds them they chose silence once." Inside the silk, a tooth. Large, human, ancient. It hummed. He placed it on the edge of the crucible. The stone's glow dulled slightly, like it was holding its breath. Outside, the figures took one step forward in unison. Just one. The larger owl turned its head, a full 180 degrees. "Told you. Should have skipped the theatrics." The smaller owl pecked the windowsill once. "You humans always overstir." The hollow sighed and pulled the red feather, left behind by the ash figure, from the sill. He dipped it into the cracked crucible like a quill. It hissed, sizzled, then vanished. Consumed. The stone trembled. Then the voices started again. Not from the graveyard this time. Not from outside at all. From the stone, clear, soft, childlike. "Are you sure you want this?" He stared, and whispered back, "I've always wanted this." The stone pulsed, a heartbeat. And then, it began to lift, just an inch from the crucible's floor, unsupported, spinning slowly, humming. Around it, sparks rose, not fiery but silvery and cold, like fireflies made of moonlight. The hollow stepped back. The stone was complete, and that's when the room tilted. Not drastically, just enough to throw his balance and send a few flasks tumbling from shelves. Mercury spilled across the table. A jar of powdered widow's ash shattered at his feet. The stone hovered still, but behind it, above it, something unfurled, like smoke given muscle. It reached from the crucible, a long coiling trail of nothingness, made visible only by the way it devoured light. Every flickering candle dimmed. The furnace hissed, and in the center of that shadow, a face, half-formed, angular, mouthless. Watching him, not malevolent, not even curious. Just there. This, he knew, was the price. The Philosopher's Stone had been born in a room straddling life and death, ancient and patient, always collects. But it hadn't attacked him. It didn't seem to intend harm. Instead, the shadow shifted, extended a single tendril toward the stone, and tapped it, just once. The stone flickered, paused its spinning, then resumed. The tendril withdrew, and the face vanished, as if satisfied. The hollow exhaled, and outside, silence. He turned to the window again. The graveyard was still full, but the figures no longer moved. They stood like statues, shadows cast by a sun that had forgotten its set. And then one by one, they bowed, not to him, to it. The stone. Inside the forge, the crucible let out one final sigh and shattered silently into dust. The Philosopher's Stone hovered gently to the table, untouched, still glowing, still humming, still listening, and the hollow. He collapsed into the chair beside it. Not in exhaustion, but in awe. He'd done it. After decades of study, loss, whispered warnings, and nearly being eaten by a sentient grimoire, he had done it. And somewhere deep beneath the floor, something ancient turned over in its sleep, for the first time in centuries. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Sleep implies safety, and no matter how triumphant the room might have felt, no matter how softly the Philosopher's Stone glowed on the scorched table, it was not safety that filled the air, it was anticipation. The stone made no sound, not technically, but it hummed with a presence that reminded the hollow of a beehive pressed too close to the skin. Vibrations, promise, danger, all neatly packaged in a red pebble the size of a sparrow's heart. He reached toward it, then stopped, not out of fear, out of etiquette. This wasn't just a tool. Not gold, not silver, just iron, worn smooth by time. It had belonged to her. He kissed it once, then set it down beside the stone. The stone pulsed gently, accepted, and then he placed his fingers, bare, hesitant, on its surface. Warm. No. Warm is too small a word. It was correct, like finally pressing your palm to something that had been carved for you alone. It didn't burn, it didn't buzz. It fit, and as soon as he touched it, the world changed. Not violently, not dramatically. Just a shift in texture. The room folded inward. The air tasted sweeter. A pressure lifted from behind his eyes. For the first time in decades, his back straightened without pain, and in the center of his mind, a voice, not words, not sentences, just understanding. Now, you may ask. He didn't hesitate. Will it work? A pause. Then, it always does. For a while. Cryptic. Naturally. The stone had no obligation to be clear. He drew his hand back, slowly. The moment lingered, hanging in the air like perfume. Even after his fingers left its surface, the warmth remained in his skin. And now came the true test. Transmutation. It wasn't about turning lead to gold. Not really. That was a metaphor passed down to keep kings funding their royal alchemists. The real goal was change. The shift of one reality into another. He retrieved a lump of iron from the shelf, heavy, crude, and cold. He'd mined it himself from the cave beneath the old ruined bell tower, said to be cursed. Definitely home to a family of disapproving bats. He placed it beside the stone. No chance this time. No symbols, just will. He touched the iron, then the stone, then the iron again, and the metal sighed. It shimmered, first dull grey, then flashing silver, then gold. Not shiny gold, but true gold. Soft, heavy, malleable. The hollow smiled for the first time in what felt like centuries, and the owls applauded. Literally, the smaller one used its wings. The larger one just blinked slowly and muttered, "Took you long enough." From the forge came a low chime. He turned. A clock. No. He didn't own a clock. It was the crucible's dust. It was ringing. Tiny flecks of ash lifted into the air, orbiting the space where the crucible once stood, forming a loose spiral. At its center, a sigil, one not carved or drawn, but appearing through absence. An ancient mark, older than Latin, older than stone. They didn't move. Another knock. This time softer, but not more distant. Closer. He approached the door, slowly, cautiously. His hand hovered over the latch. Then he whispered, "Who comes?" And a voice, tired, dry, and oddly familiar, answered, "You did, once." He opened the door. No one there. But in the dirt outside the threshold, footprints, small, barefoot. Child's footprints, leading away into the fog. He stood there for a moment, not stepping out, just watching. Then he looked back at the stone. It had stopped pulsing. It had gone still, waiting. Because this was part of it, wasn't it? Not just creation. Reckoning. He looked down again. The prints had vanished. But in their place, a single object, a coin. Ancient, worn smooth, marked with a symbol that matched the one now etched into his wall in ash. He picked it up. Cold. Heavy. A toll. The stone shimmered once, then went dark. Not lifeless. Just sleeping. The hollow stepped back inside, sat again, and whispered, mostly to himself. They always said the third strike awakens the dead. Perfectly red, perfectly quiet, perfectly awake. And the graveyard had changed. He could feel it before he could see it, like the pressure drop before a storm. The air had lost its chill, but not in a pleasant way. More like a fever had settled over the land. When he stepped outside on the third morning after the third strike, the ground squelched. Not mud, not water. Soft, like memory. The tombstones were still there, but something about them was off. They had turned. He stood in the overgrown grass, his cloak wrapped tight, and stared. Each grave marker had pivoted, facing a single direction. Not outward toward the trees, nor inward toward the chapel ruins. No, they all pointed directly toward his forge. They were watching. The dead were paying attention now, and he couldn't decide if that was an honor or a threat. He did what any reasonable alchemist would do. He took notes. He drew each stone's new position, its tilt, its angle, and measured the degree of rotation. He even mapped them on a crude grid, using lengths of twine and old chicken bones. The pattern that emerged was familiar, uncomfortably so. A sigil, one found carved onto an obsidian amulet pulled from a mass grave during the 30 Years' War. A sigil no one could translate. A scholar in Vienna had once claimed it meant "we return." Another swore it said, "Now you listen." Historians still argue about the origin, but all agree wherever it appeared, strange births and stranger deaths followed, and now, the pattern lay beneath his boots. He returned to the forge with purpose. He needed answers, and there was only one place to get them. The grimoire. It sat on the workbench, still warm to the touch. Its pages no longer shuffled themselves in the night, but he sensed it wasn't resting. It was waiting. He opened to the chapter titled Interference. The ink had changed. Previously black, it now gleamed red, like it had been rewritten in blood. The first line read, "When the stone breathes, the world forgets the order it once obeyed." Chilling. He turned the page. More warnings, more riddles. Then, near the bottom, the third strike awakens, but the fourth invites. The fourth? Not the walls, not the roof. The forge. He walked to it, heart thudding softly against his ribs. Inside, ash remained from the shattered crucible, and resting in that ash, impossibly upright, was a single nail, iron, hand-forged, old, but not his. He hadn't placed it there. He reached for it, hesitated, then gripped it gently, warm, just like the stone. He turned it in his hand, no markings, no signature, until he breathed on it. Then, briefly etched by fog, it read, "Strike again." He dropped it. It landed point down in the ash, and stood perfectly still, as if it had always belonged there. The stone on the table hummed once, the soft sound of agreement or expectation. It was hard to tell. The hollow backed away. This was beyond the plan. This was no longer alchemy. This was invitation. He closed the grimoire, locked it in the iron box, slid the heavy bolt across it, and placed a wax seal over the hinge. Then he pulled the heavy curtains across the windows, and placed salt along the doorframe. He sat down, hands on his knees, staring at the nail. If the fourth strike invited something, he had to decide. Did he really want to open the door? And if so, to what? Outside, the owls were silent, not gone, just listening. That worried him more than anything. For the first time he realized that they, too, might not have been sent to watch the ritual, but to guard against it. He sat in silence until the candle burned low. Then, faintly, just before the wick gave out, a voice inside the nail. "The dead are patient. Are you?" Morning never really came. The sky paled slightly, enough to convince the rooster in the next village to offer a tired crow, but the sun never crested the horizon. Not truly. It stayed hidden, perhaps out of caution, perhaps in protest. The hollow couldn't blame it. Even celestial bodies knew when to keep their distance. Inside the forge, the stone remained still, perfect, too perfect. He hadn't touched it again, not since the fourth element, the nail, had appeared. Now it sat beside the stone like a forgotten relic at the edge of a holy site. And maybe that's exactly what it was. A relic, a piece of something older than alchemy, older than ritual, older than memory. He'd tried once, the night before, to toss the nail into the fire, just to test what would happen. It didn't burn, didn't melt, didn't even heat. It simply reappeared back in the forge's ash pile, upright, humming faintly, like a stubborn truth, refusing to be denied. He wasn't ready to strike again. Not yet. Instead, he turned to one of the lesser scrolls, Apocrypha Lapidum, translated by a mostly blind scribe with too many thumbs and not enough vowels. The scroll was thick with mold and mystery, but a particular passage had once fascinated him. "The fourth key is not for the door, but for the welcome. Strike it, and you do not open. You invite. You kneel." The hollow didn't like kneeling. His knees weren't built for it anymore, and besides, he'd bowed to kings before, and hated every second. Still, the idea scratched at the back of his brain. He turned to other sources. A letter penned by an alchemist who vanished in the Alps during a red moon. A charcoal rubbing from a cave wall in Sardinia, depicting a man striking a rock and summoning a mouth. And one obscure fragment from an Egyptian funerary tablet, usually mistranslated as a recipe for embalming paste, but which the hollow believed to be something else entirely. "The dead do not awaken for gold. They stir for memory. Offer them yours." He understood. The stone wasn't finished. It was waiting for him to finish it. He would need a catalyst, a rare one. Something volatile, something wrong. He walked to the cupboard beside the sink, where he kept only one item, a small ceramic jar with a lid that refused to stay sealed. From inside him, the shape flowed from his hand like water, loops, spines, a downward spiral, a clawed point. It looked like a key eating itself. When he finished, the ink steamed, the table warped around the sigil, wood bowed inward, the hammer, that hammer, the one meant for strikes, rolled toward the edge of the table without being touched, and the stone, it shifted, just slightly. But it moved closer to the sigil. He'd drawn something true. He sat back, stared at his own hand. The ink had bled into his palm. His veins now glistened black. "Temporary," he muttered. The smaller owl on the windowsill sneezed. "Nope," it said. "That's permanent." The hollow turned to the window. "What do you mean?" The larger owl blinked slowly. "You've marked yourself." "Marked for what?" "For remembering," the small one whispered. "You just opened your memory to them." "Who's them?" They didn't answer, but the stone did. It rose, hovered 3 inches above the sigil, spun once, then stopped, and cracked. Not a shattering, not destruction, but a clean central fissure, like an eyelid parting. From within, a light, not red, not gold, but white, pure, terrifying. The hollow flinched back. The room grew colder. His fingertips tingled. From the stone's glowing seam emerged smoke, not smoke. Too slow, too deliberate. It was ink, ink like the kind that had stained his hand. It flowed up into the air and began to shape itself, forming spirals, sigils, the outline of a face. He knew that face, but not from life, from a dream, one he hadn't had in years. A woman, young, sad eyes, pale mouth. She'd spoken to him in his sleep once, on the night he first saw the comet over the southern hills. She said, "If you call me, I must come." Now here she was, formed from the stone-sipped breath, and smiling. He whispered, "What are you?" And she answered, in a voice as dry as pressed flowers, "I am the fourth." He wanted to move. He didn't. The face tilted, considering him. "You made a door. I am the one who answers it." He breathed, shallow. "And the others?" She turned slightly, looked out the window, at the graveyard. They're waiting their turn. The hollow held still, barely breathing, as the face hovered before him, half-formed, delicate, made entirely from streaming ink that defied gravity. It wafted through the air like a scent that had found structure, shimmering with suggestion rather than substance. And yet, somehow, it was real, real enough to chill his bones, real enough to smile. The face tilted again, as if listening to something only she could hear. Then she spoke. "Your world still clings to borders. This is why it must be corrected." He blinked. Borders? Between life and death, between memory and matter, between want and should not want. That last phrase struck him with the weight of unspoken guilt. He had wanted this. He had wanted this. Not just the stone, not just the transformation of base metals. He wanted the forbidden thing, knowledge beyond knowledge. The kind that rewrote what the world considered possible, the kind you had to lose yourself to earn. The face drifted closer, the hollow skin prickled. "You made me because you remembered her," she said softly. He opened his mouth to deny it, but stopped. Of course it had been about her. The stone wasn't simply a philosopher's toy. It was born of essence, sacrifice, and the deep longing that made men carve ruins into the earth. It took his blood, his breath, his memory, and her name. The woman made of ink circled the table, leaving no footsteps, her presence trailing faint whispers in dead languages. As she passed the grimoire, the iron box trembled. She smiled without teeth. "You've stirred them, you know." "The others, the dead?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "Not dead, adjacent. Those that forgot they were supposed to stay quiet." From the corner, the owls watched silently now, no longer sarcastic, no longer witty, just wide-eyed, alert. The stone hovered above the sigil still, its crack glowing brighter. The air was thick with memory, so much so that the hollow began to feel things that weren't his. A wedding gown in the rain, a child coughing blood, a field full of violet poppies that swayed toward a different sun. The woman turned to face him again. "There is one more strike to give." He shook his head. "The fourth was the last." "No," she said. "That was the invitation. This is the answer." She reached for the nail. It lifted before she touched it, floated gently across the air, hovering just over the stone, waiting. He stepped forward, hesitated. "What happens if I do it?" Her voice grew quieter. "You won't know, until you forget." That wasn't comforting. Still, he reached for the hammer again. Its grip felt heavier now, as if weighed by decision, not steel. He looked down at the floating nail. His heart pounded. Then something moved in the corner. He turned fast, expecting another visitor from the stone's breath, but instead, the mirror caught his eye. The cracked, tarnished mirror he'd used to watch the crucible. It was glowing, not with light. Himself, young, sitting by a fire, holding her hand, she was laughing. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, just softly, naturally. He hadn't remembered this moment in years, maybe decades. The mirror shimmered again. Now they were dancing. Badly. He was stepping on her toes. She didn't mind. The next shimmer. Her grave, rain. No one else in attendance. He stepped back. The ink woman stood beside him now, watching the mirror too. "You can keep her," she whispered. "But only if you lose yourself." He looked at the nail again. The final strike wasn't about power. It wasn't about gold, or eternal life, or unlocking the secrets of the cosmos. It was about choice. What would you give up to reclaim what should have stayed gone? He looked at his hands. Old. Scarred. Tired. He'd come so far, he'd made the impossible real, but he wasn't done. He couldn't stop now. He returned to the table, lifted the hammer once more. The owls shuffled behind him. "You sure about this?" the smaller one asked, voice low and dry. "No," he said, "but I've never been sure of anything that mattered." And he struck the nail. The fifth strike. It wasn't a sound. It was a reverberation. A wave. Every item in the room lifted an inch from the surface it touched. Violet poppies swayed under a cloudless sky, and ahead, by the crooked tree, she stood, smiling, alive. He walked to her. The stone was nowhere in sight. The owls were gone. He didn't care. She reached for his hand. He took it. It was warm. Real. She leaned in. Whispered a name. His. Not the one he'd burned. The one he'd buried. He remembered it now, and he wept. Because he'd come home. The air in the field was unnaturally still, not peaceful, suspended, as if the wind itself had been instructed to wait. He stood beside her, this woman whose name he'd once torn from memory and sealed away with widow's ink. Now she stood before him, not as a ghost, not as a symbol, but flesh, breath, presence. Her hand was in his, fingers warm and coal-used from the work of someone who had lived, not lingered. She smiled, not that dreamy, wispy smile so often granted to memories, but a real one, tired, a little sad. But hers. The hollow, though that name felt foreign now, opened his mouth, and for the first time in years, no words came out. He didn't need them. She looked up at him and said, "Only, you did it. But it wasn't for you, was it?" He closed his eyes. The fifth strike had not granted gold, nor immortality, nor the unlocking of forbidden equations. It had opened a door not meant for a man of tools and flame, but for a man of grief, and grief had stepped through first. "I wanted," he began, then faltered. "I thought maybe, if I found the stone, if I made it real, you could undo the moment," she finished. "The one you couldn't live through." He nodded. She let go of his hand, not harshly, not coldly, just, finally. The air shimmered. From behind him, the field began to collapse. Not violently, just folding in on itself, like a dream politely, taking its leave. The tree vanished. The poppies curled inward, becoming paper thin, then nothing. And when he turned again, she was gone. But he wasn't back in the forge. No, this was something else. He stood in a vast grey space, endless in all directions. It smelled like ash and metal, and the ground below his feet rang faintly with each step. Floating in the center was the Philosopher's stone, whole again, uncracked, silent, and beside it, the mirror, still showing not his reflection, but versions of him. Some old, some younger, one, unrecognizable. It had no face, just hands that burned with fire from the wrist down, endlessly shaping, endlessly failing. The mirror shifted again. Now it showed the forge, the real one, the broken crucible, the spilled powders, the scattered vials, empty, but the door was wide open. And the graveyard, gone. No headstones, no soil, just flat, dead land, untouched, unmarked, as if no one had ever been buried there. The hollow stepped toward the mirror, touched the surface gently. It rippled, then whispered, "You returned what was taken. The world thanks you by forgetting." He blinked. The weight of the words curled in his chest like warm lead. Forgetting. So that was the cost. Not just his memory, but everyone else's. The world no longer knew what had stirred beneath the soil. The doors were sealed again, the whispers silenced, and the stone, it would vanish from myth once more. The mirror faded, and suddenly he was standing again inside the forge. The window was open. Sunlight, real sunlight, real sunlight. Birdsong, no owls in sight. The table was clean, empty, the ash gone, the cracked crucible replaced with an unmarked stone bowl, and the philosopher's stone. Nowhere. He staggered to the door. Outside the grass had returned. The gate to the graveyard hung straight and still, but the graves were back. Headstones quiet, ground undisturbed, no markings, no sigils, no signs of movement, just peace. For the first time in a long time, the Hollow felt something foreign in his chest, stillness, but completion. His hands hung loose at his sides. He didn't know his name, not yet, but he remembered the woman, and the poppies, and the fifth strike, and that was enough. From behind him, something rustled on the table. He turned. The only item left, a small slip of parchment, no seal, no ink, just one word, burned into its fibers. Rest. He smiled, let out a long, long breath, and sat down. No plans. No rituals. No fire. Just silence. And for once, he let it hold him. It took 3 days before he said another word, not out of trauma or awe, but because for the first time in memory, there was nothing demanding to be said. No whispering walls. No shifting shadows. Just air, firewood, and the occasional blackbird that hopped near the windowsill, peeking in as though expecting a potion to be offered. The forge had gone quiet, but not dead. It now breathed with a soft kind of rhythm, like the room itself was sleeping, content to rest now that its work was done. Returned to whatever threshold it had crossed to get here. The Hollow. Yes, he still called himself that, though the name no longer felt like a curse. Spent his hours cleaning. He swept up remnants of powders that no longer clung to magic. He replaced shattered glass with fresh flasks. He reshelved the scrolls, now inert, though they hummed faintly when touched, as if remembering something their scribe could not. He didn't attempt transmutations. He didn't draw symbols. He boiled water. He peeled potatoes. He watched the sunrise. And during this time, no one came to the forge. Not a single curious villager. Not a merchant. Not a ghost. It was as if the world, having held its breath, had finally exhaled, and in that breath, forgotten the man who had touched the divine. Then, on the 4th day, a knock, 3 taps, slow, familiar. He opened the door with no alarm, no fear, no expectations. Standing there, just beyond the threshold, was a boy, maybe 12, red scarf, dirt on his cheeks, holding a lopsided basket of root vegetables. He blinked. "You're the hermit, right?" The Hollow considered the title. Hermit. It sounded less ominous than the Hollow, and far less exhausting than alchemist. "Suppose I am," he said. The boy thrust the basket forward. "Mum says we owe you for the protection charm last spring. This is for that." He accepted the basket, its weight humble and grounding. "Tell your mother I said thank you. She says you probably saved our roof from catching fire when the lightning hit." He nodded. That had been before the 3rd strike, before the ash whispered his name, before the stone cracked open like an egg and spilled the boundary between life and everything else. And yet, no one remembered any of that. Not even the sky. The boy lingered a moment, peeking past the Hollow's legs. "You don't have a dragon or anything, do you?" The Hollow chuckled. "Not anymore." The boy's eyes widened. He left soon after, kicking at stones, probably forming some wild theory to share with the other children. The Hollow closed the door, set the basket on the table, and realized something. He hadn't felt alone, not since the field. Not since she spoke his name. He returned to his chair, not the one by the table, the one in the corner, near the furnace, the one he used to sit in during storms. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened. No humming, no ink voices, no phantom mirrors, only birdsong, fire crackle, and faintly, the creak of the world remembering how to be ordinary. Still, he wondered. He'd felt her in the field, the way her hand fit into his, the warmth, the name. Was it real? Or was it a gift from the stone? A final vision offered as payment for all he'd lost? He'd never know. And for once, that was all right. The grimoire remained sealed. The ashes never reappeared. The nail, nowhere to be found. But every once in a while, when dusk fell just so and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the grass, he would swear the stones still pulsed beneath the floor, not demanding, not calling, just reminding that it had been made, that it had watched, and that it remembered him. He didn't speak of it, not to the boy, not to the birds, not to the wind. He simply lived. And in the quiet, the world gently knit itself back together. No one knew how close it had come to folding inside out. No one remembered the fourth gate. No one remembered the strike that echoed beneath bone. But the hollow did. And some nights, just for a second, he could still hear her voice in the space between stars. You came home. Weeks passed. The leaves began to brown. Then drop. The winds shifted, bringing the smell of burning wood from distant farms, the echo of harvest bells. It was autumn now, the time of year when things ripen for the last time before they let go. The hollow understood that rhythm more intimately than ever. He had resumed a routine, simple, solid, human. He would wake before the sun, boil tea over the fire, walk the edge of the hollow to gather herbs, not for potions but for soups, salves, and the occasional balm for aching joints. The scrolls remained shelved. The chalk circles that once marked summoning thresholds were long since scrubbed clean, and in their place, baskets of garlic and dried lavender hung from the beams. It was peaceful. It was strange. No one had tried to raise the dead. No creature had crawled from the woods, asking for a favor. The owls hadn't returned. It almost felt too quiet, and that's when the owl came back. Just one this time. Not the large one with the sarcastic eyes, or the small one with frayed feathers. This one was different. Sleek, pale, and wearing what appeared to be a tiny brass key around its neck. It landed on the open windowsill one evening, without a sound, just after dusk. The hollow didn't flinch. He only looked up from his stew and said, "I wondered how long you'd wait." The owl didn't answer, but it did drop something, a small envelope, unsealed, smelling faintly of burnt honey. He picked it up, unfolded it. No ink, no signature, just embossed symbols, 3 of them. A spiral, a door, a hand. He felt a tightness in his chest he couldn't name. "Is it starting again?" he asked aloud. The owl didn't hoot, but it blinked once, very slowly. He took that as a yes, and then the owl was gone. No sound, no flap, just vanished. The hollow set the note aside and stirred the stew again, a little more slowly. He didn't stir panic. He spent too much time with terror, awe, and madness to give them free rent now. Instead, he did what he always did. He took notes on a blank page of an old ledger. He drew the 3 symbols, carefully with reverence. Beneath them he wrote, "Not over," just paused. That night, he did not sleep in the chair. He went to the cellar. Behind the stairs, buried beneath bricks he'd laid with his own hands, was a small, forgotten trunk. He unsealed it. Inside, relics of the life before the forge, before the graveyard, before the girl who had smiled at him in a dream. A copper ring, a bundle of folded letters, tied in blue string, a map of the world, hand-drawn and riddled with mistakes. And a jar, sealed tightly. Within it, breath, his taken on the day she died. He had stored it, foolishly thinking one day he might breathe it back in and feel something again. He hadn't, until now. He held it, listened. And deep in the forge above him, the stone pulsed once, so faintly you could mistake it for wind, but it wasn't wind. He rose slowly, replaced the bricks, went upstairs, sat at the table where the parchment still waited. He touched the hand symbol. It shimmered faintly beneath his fingers, and from nowhere, a single word entered his mind. Soon. He did not ask for clarification. He had learned by now that answers rarely came in full. The trick wasn't in knowing, it was in being ready. Outside, the graveyard remained still, but in his dreams that night, he saw the poppies again. This time, they faced him, and bowed. The hollow awoke just before dawn, heart steady but breath shallow. The dream had clung to him longer than most. It wasn't just the poppies this time, it was what lay beneath them. He remembered walking the field, the same crooked tree swaying at the hill's crest. The poppies, thousands, maybe millions, bent toward him, and when he reached down to touch one, it bled. Not dramatically, just a single bead of red at the stem, like a pinprick in skin. He dropped it in the dream, stumbled back, Then the soil pulsed. Once. And he'd woken up, still alone, still in the forge, still waiting for something he hadn't agreed to summon. He moved slowly through the morning, heating tea, rinsing his face in the chipped basin near the fire. The fog outside was thick, curling along the ground like it had secrets to deliver, and in the quiet, he felt the forge's rhythm again. The faint hum beneath the floorboards. The stone wasn't gone. It was resting, recovering, and maybe changing. He lit a single candle and moved to the grimoire, still sealed, still warm. He placed his hand over the iron lock and whispered, "Not yet." The book didn't move, but something deep inside it heard. Instead, he turned to his shelf of lesser books, cookbooks, herbal indexes, his own childhood notes on how to make a salve from moss and spring rain. He flipped idly through pages until a slip of parchment fell loose. Not his handwriting. Not hers. New, unsettlingly precise. Each letter shaped like it had been carved instead of written. One line only. "You must show someone." He stared at it for a long time. No name, no signature, no suggestion of who or what had left it. He flipped the parchment over. Blank. Outside, a crow landed on the windowsill. Not an owl this time. Not a silent messenger. Just a crow, loud, confident. It cawed 3 times and flew off, and from the tree line across the field, someone waved. Not a ghost, not a shadow. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the robes of a traveling scholar, packs slung over one shoulder. The hollow narrowed his eyes. Visitors were rare, uninvited ones, rarer still. But this man, he stood casually, not expectant, not hostile, as if he'd simply wandered into the world at the exact moment he was needed. The hollow opened the door, stepping out into the fog. The air was colder than it should been. "Can I help you?" he called. The man didn't speak, just raised something into the air. A coin, worn smooth. Bronze, maybe copper, but the hollow saw it clearly. A downward-pointing arrow. The same symbol that had once been seared into the cover of the grimoire. The hollow stepped forward cautiously. "Where did you get that?" The man finally spoke. Voice steady. Familiar. Too familiar. "You gave it to me." The hollow froze, looked closer. The man, this tall, quiet figure. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either. And something about the way he stood, the way his left foot pointed slightly outward, the way his fingers twitched when idle, he recognized himself, or a version of himself. Possibly one that had struck the nail a 6th time. "You're from beyond," the hollow whispered. The man smiled faintly. "Beyond what? Don't be clever." The man shrugged. "I'm not. I've just forgotten what it's like to be you." They stood in silence. Fog moved between them like a lazy stream. Then the man said, "They told me you need to teach it." The hollow frowned. "Teach what?" "The process." "The truth." "The stone." The hollow scoffed. "It can be taught. It must. I broke the world to make it. And now you must unbreak it." The wind stirred. Leaves circled at their feet. The hollow felt the weight of something enormous moving just beyond his sight, like an idea growing roots beneath his thoughts. He looked toward the forge. Its windows glowed faintly now, though no flame was lit. And he understood. The 5th strike had not been the end. It had been an opening. A crack in reality, through which memory and form, grief and will, life and what waits behind it had begun to bleed. And if someone else had followed his path, someone he himself had already become, then the spiral wasn't closing, it was widening. How many? The hollow asked. The man, his future self, or perhaps just another echo, tilted his head. Enough. And then he held out a scroll, sealed with wax. Pressed with a sigil that hadn't yet been invented. The hollow took it. Hands trembling slightly, the man nodded, and without another word, turned and vanished into the fog, not into the woods, into the air itself. Like ink dispersing into water, the hollow stood alone again, but not untouched, not forgotten, and not finished. He looked down at the scroll, unbroken seal, unwritten history, and a memory rising behind his eyes, of a red stone, a cracked crucible, and a woman who said, "You came home." He didn't open the scroll right away. Instead, he brought it inside, set it on the table beside a half-finished loaf of bread and a cup of mint tea gone cold. It looked too ordinary in that setting. The wax seal didn't glow or hum, didn't leak blood or whisper. It simply existed, waiting to be read the way all scrolls wait, patiently, arrogantly. The hollow stared at it for hours. He didn't touch it. He chopped wood, fed the fire, stared out the window at a sky that never quite decided whether to rain. But the scroll waited. That evening, when the sky turned the color of bruised lilac, he unsealed it, and what he found was not what he expected. No ancient glyphs, no alchemical maps, no instructions, just a name. His. The one he had burned long ago, written in clean, delicate strokes, and beneath it, a single phrase, "Your turn again." He set the scroll down gently, like it might break. He stood, he paced. Then he walked out the door, into the dusk air, toward the edge of the hollow. There, nestled between twisted hawthorn trees, was a patch of earth he hadn't visited in years. No stones marked it. No symbols guarded it. Just a memory. He crouched there, touching the soil. "Your turn again," he whispered, and the ground answered, not with sound but with a shift, a warmth, as if something beneath remembered being held. A choice, then. The scroll had not instructed, it had invited. He could walk away, live out the rest of his days as a quiet man with calloused hands and unremarkable routines, or he could begin again. Start the spiral from a new point, maybe this time not as an alchemist, maybe as a teacher. He stood slowly. The forge door creaked as he returned inside. He cleared the main table, brushed off the soot that still clung to the corners. He retrieved a blank parchment, dipped a fresh quill into ordinary ink, and began to write, not spells, not rituals, but reminders. He wrote of the silence before the first strike, of the whispers that never truly leave, of the warmth of a memory made flesh. He wrote of the fifth strike, the cost, the reward, the pause. He titled the first page, "How Not to Forget Her." It wasn't for students. Not yet. It was for him. A manual for remembering, for choosing what to carry forward. Outside, the wind picked up. Leaves danced across the path, like children playing, and inside, the forge warmed, not from fire, but from purpose. He worked through the night. He boiled herbs, dried roots, mixed simple potions that healed minor aches, not to sell, not for power, but because he could. At one point, he found himself singing, a lullaby he didn't recognize, until the final line escaped his lips, and he realized it was hers, the one she'd hum while stirring soup. The stone never returned. Not physically, but its echo lingered in the way he moved, less hurried, more deliberate. Each step weighed against what might echo after. The grimoire remained sealed. The scroll, now re-rolled, sat beneath the windowsill bound with twine. And every few nights, when he lit a fire and warmed a bit of mead, he would glance toward it. Sometimes it glowed, just faintly, and he knew someone else had struck their third blow. He was not the only one anymore. The spiral continued, but now someone watched it, guided it. He was no longer the seeker, he was the mark on the map. The quiet place future hands would point to and say, "Here. Here's where he changed it." And so, the hollow began again, not as a collector of relics, not as a summoner of the dead, but as a keeper of peace, a historian of grief, a witness to the soft, strange miracle of remembering. And on the edge of the hollow, where the graves once whispered, he planted seeds, poppies. Only a few. But they grew quickly, as if they knew. The poppies took root faster than they should have. By the time a full moon passed, a dozen red blooms had scattered across the rise behind the forge. They nodded in the breeze as though in quiet agreement with everything the world had become. One day, while trimming back the undergrowth around the edge of the old fence line, he discovered something unexpected, a boot print, fresh, small, too small for the man he'd met in the fog, and not childlike either. Someone new had been there. He didn't panic, didn't go searching, just waited. If they wanted to be found, they would. And the following week, they did. A girl, 16, maybe 17, skin like sun-warmed bark, hair pulled back with a cord of braided nettles. She stood just beyond the poppy field with a crooked walking stick and a leather satchel covered in chalk glyphs. She didn't flinch when he approached, didn't call him Mr. or Sir or Alchemist. She just nodded and said, "I followed the whisper." He knew what she meant. Not the sound, the pull, the one that started deep in the ribs and crawled upward until your hands moved before your mind did. "I had a dream," she said, "of a red stone and a door made of breath." Of course she did. They always dreamed something. He offered her tea. She accepted. She didn't speak again until the cup was half empty. Then she asked the question. Not, do you have the philosopher sip stone, or can you teach me alchemy? No, she asked. What did you forget to remember? His hands stilled. The fire crackled, and he realized that was the right question. The stone, after all, had never been about power. It was about remembrance, the act of choosing which truths to bury and which to carry forward, of knowing the weight of both. I forgot, he said slowly, that love is not meant to be preserved like artifacts. It's meant to change you. She listened, eyes steady. You still carry it, she said. He nodded. Not all of it, but enough. She took out a book from her satchel, bound in rough hide, marked with scrawls of geometry and runes too fresh to be ancient. Her own notes, her own journey. She placed it on the table, pushed it toward him. I think it's my turn. He opened the book, read a few lines, symbols, half correct, dangerous in their way, but promising. He closed it gently. You've started something, he said. That's good. She smiled. Then teach me how to finish it. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and went to the cabinet, pulled out a bottle of copper ink, one of the few remaining remnants of his earlier days. He set it before her. You'll need this. And then, slowly, methodically, he began to open the drawer that held the sealed scroll, the one marked with the sigil of the arrow, spiral, and hand. He unrolled it before them both, and as he did, the symbols rearranged, no longer static, no longer fixed. Now they formed a map, not of land, of moments, circles, nodes, threads of glowing ink that pulsed as he traced his finger over them. Each point, a strike, a gate, a lesson. The girl leaned closer, whispered, Is that everyone? He nodded. Everyone who's dared, everyone who will. She traced one circle in particular, small, off to the side, dim, but flickering. I think that one's mine. He smiled. And for the first time in years, it didn't ache. You'll find it, he said. Outside the poppies swayed. Not in the wind. There was no wind. They swayed like something beneath the earth was breathing again. Not in unrest, but in rhythm. She stayed the night, slept in the small loft he'd never used. By morning, the forge was filled with light, and new notes lined the workbench. Fresh ink, fresh questions. The spiral continued, but this time, he wasn't walking it alone. He was guiding it, and someone was finally listening. The forge had changed. Not physically. The stones remained uneven. The chimney still sighed when the wind blew just right. The table still bore the faint scorch mark where a poorly mixed tincture had once exploded with the fury of a sneeze. But the air was different, lighter. It no longer bore the weight of decades-old secrets pressed between cracks. It hummed now with the promise of beginnings. Not for him, but for her. The girl, she still hadn't offered a name, and he hadn't asked, rose with the sun, and slept by the low-burning fire. She worked with quiet intensity, the kind born not from obedience but hunger. She wanted to know. Not to impress. Not to dominate. To understand. He recognized that fire. Once, it had nearly consumed him. Now, he guided it. He gave her small tasks first, brewing base tinctures, drying leaves, categorizing stones not by size or shape, but by temperature of touch. What a stone feels like, he explained, is more truthful than what it looks like people. She sulked for 5 minutes, then returned inside, and chopped roots like a repentant apprentice. He almost smiled. Later, he handed her an old scroll, not the grimoire, not yet, but one of the lesser fragments, preserved from his early failures. She read it without speaking. Only once did she look up, during a section on lead's resistance to spiritual memory. Why does lead remember sadness more than joy? She asked. Because it's heavy, he said simply, and she nodded. The scroll spoke of early transmutations, minor shifts, turning iron to copper, water to dust, salt to sugar, all of it technical, the dry side of alchemy, but it also hinted at the other side, the part no one teaches until they see what you're made of. The Hollow watched her closely as she reached that section, and when she reached the passage titled Resonance of Loss, she stopped reading. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just pressed her hand to the parchment, like it might pulse with heat. She said, "My brother," fell through ice. He said nothing, only poured 2 cups of tea, and handed her the stronger one. Later that day, he unsealed the grimoire. For the first time since the fifth strike, the seal broke without sound. The cover opened willingly, like a sigh long held. She approached it with the cautious awe one gives to relics and gravestones. He didn't tell her not to touch it. He let her choose. She didn't. Instead, she asked, "Was this the book that gave you the stone?" He shook his head. "This is the book that told me how to ask for it." She frowned. "You asked?" "No. I thought I was demanding. Turns out I was begging." She didn't ask for clarification. Smart. Some things teach more through silence. Over the next week, her questions sharpened. Became less about method, more about why. Why use blood? Why does mercury resist only when it senses you're unsure? Why do the dead whisper instead of shout? He answered carefully. Not always truthfully, because part of the path is learning which answers to ignore. One night, she caught him staring at the stone sept's old resting place. "You miss it," she said. He shook his head. "I respect it. That sept's not the same." "No," he said. "It isn't sept. And now it's not." She didn't push further, but the next morning she drew a symbol on the window pane in condensation. He recognized it. The fifth gate, the strike that invited. He watched her, wary and impressed. Because she didn't draw the stone. She drew the mirror. That meant she understood. Not power, not transformation, but consequence. He gave her her first proper lesson the next day, on ash, on how not all that burns is destroyed, and that some things whisper louder once they've been reduced to powder. More poppies. Brighter now. He wondered how many more would grow, how many others had begun to dream, and whether the spiral would circle back to him once more. But for now, he had someone to teach, and a story to watch unfold. Not his, hers. Autumn deepened. The air grew sharper. Leaves browned, then surrendered altogether, blanketing the ground in a crisp hush. It was the season of things returning to earth, of endings, or what looked like endings. Inside the forge, the girl practiced quietly. She had begun to hum as she worked, low melodies, often without pattern, sometimes without pitch. But the hum served a purpose. It made the mercury behave, when stirred in time to her rhythm. It didn't flee the crucible. It shimmered, danced, waited. She didn't need to be told this. She felt it. The hollow watched from his chair near the hearth. Not hovering, just present. Sometimes offering a correction, often letting her fail. She failed well, and that, more than anything, meant she might succeed. On the 8th night of frost, he presented her with a test. He set a lump of iron on the table. Dull. Cold. Inert. Beside it he placed a vial, small, sealed, etched faintly with a spiral. "I want you to turn this into something true," he said. She tilted her head. "True? Not gold, not illusion, not theory. True." She didn't ask what that meant. She took the iron in one hand, the vial in the other, and walked out to the poppy field. She knelt, sat with them, spoke to no one. She stayed out there until the moon was high, and the wind had teeth. When she returned, she placed the iron back on the table. Not visibly, but it felt different. He touched it. Warm. He opened the vial. It was empty. Or rather, it had given itself to the metal. A resonance hummed through it. Quiet. Complete. She sat across from him, smiling. He said nothing. Just nodded. That night, he had a dream. Not of her. Not of the stone. Of death. Not cloaked. Not scythe-bearing. Not theatrical. Death wore worn boots, a moth-eaten coat, and smelled faintly of gingerbread. They sat across from one another, at a simple table. "You've done well," Death said, sipping tea that wasn't sit there. "I didn't sit do it for praise. Oh, I know. You did it because you couldn't sit not. That sip's the real reason alchemists are dangerous." The hollow folded his hands. "Why now?" Death smiled, and his teeth were entirely unremarkable. "Because she's ready. And you're close." "Close to what?" "To your last question." He opened his mouth to respond, but the room folded inward like a tent collapsing, and he awoke, sweating, heart steady, and the girl was already awake, standing by the forge, poking at coals. "I heard someone knock last night," she said without turning. He rose slowly. There was no knock. She finally looked at him, not outside. He didn't reply. Instead, he handed her the mirror, the same one that had once shown him a face that never belonged to him. Tonight, he said. She nodded. That evening, after dinner, after tea, after silence, they lit a single candle and placed the mirror between them on the floor. She stared. He waited. The surface shimmered, then pulsed, and then her, not her present self, but her younger self, with mud on her cheeks, and a cut on her chin, and a boy's hand gripped tight in hers, her brother. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She only breathed, and the mirror spoke, not in words. No questions. No collapse. Just peace. Later that night, she said, "It sips not about making the stone." He smiled. "No, it sips about surviving what it asks of you." He nodded. She stared into the fire. "I think I will." "Survive?" "No," she said. "Make it." He said nothing. Just watched the fire flicker, and somewhere far beneath the floorboards, he thought he heard it again, the softest pulse. Not a call, not a threat. A reminder. Winter's fingers crept in quietly. One day there was dew, the next, frost. The forge's stones grew colder beneath bare feet, and the tea began to steam harder in the morning light. The hollow gathered wood more frequently, stacked it higher, and found himself staring longer into the hearth between lessons. The girl didn't slow. She studied more now, not just ingredients but questions. She had begun to rewrite the scrolls he lent her, not correcting them, but reframing them. She added margins where none had existed, connected rituals to memory, marked which chants worked only when sung on an empty stomach. He watched her grow not as a mimic, but as a maker, and so it was time. One evening, after a supper of roasted roots and wild onions, he placed a small wooden box on the table between them. "This belonged to my mentor," he said. She looked at it, then up at him. "Did you open it?" "Only once." "What was inside?" "It's not the stone, no. But it could be." He nodded. "That's what I was told." "And did you try?" "I almost did. I was young, angry, desperate." She studied the clay. "It's waiting." He leaned back. "That's all the stone ever really does." She placed it on the table, gently. "Can I try?" "Not yet." She didn't argue. Later that night, he took her to the cellar. The door hadn't been opened in months. Not since the fifth strike. It creaked, complained, then gave way to silence. Dust curled around their ankles as they descended. At the bottom, the circle, still intact. The ashes swept, the candles unlit. But in the center, the scar, not on the floor. In the air, a ripple, faint and still, like heat haze. She walked toward it instinctively. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Only look. Don't step through." "What sits on the other side?" More questions. Fewer rules. She stared into the ripple. For a moment, her face reflected in it. Then her brother's. Then nothing. She turned away, silent. They climbed back up together. She didn't speak the rest of the night. He didn't press her. Some lessons must be held in silence. The next day she returned to the forge early. Before him, she was drawing a new sigil in chalk. One he didn't recognize. It spiraled outward, not inward. "Yours?" he asked. She nodded. He studied it. It was elegant, balanced. It listened. "Do you know what it does?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "But it wants to remember something." He smiled. "Good." That afternoon, the mirror cracked. Not shattered, just a single line, running straight down the middle. He didn't panic. She touched it lightly. "It's done showing me the past," she said. "What's next?" She looked toward the hearth. "The fifth strike." He went still. "You don't have to." She looked at him. "I already did. In my sleep." His breath caught. "And? I didn't strike for the stone." "Then why?" She smiled faintly. "To say goodbye." That night, the forge felt full again. Not crowded, not haunted, just full, with time, with memory, with inheritance. She stood by the window before bed, watching the frost grow on the pane, and she said quietly, "It's not about making it anymore, is it?" He joined her. "No," he whispered. "It's about being ready if it comes back." She nodded. And for a long time, neither of them moved. The stone was gone, but the spiral continued, because now it was carried by two. The days shortened further. Light arrived late and left early, slipping through the forge like a shy guest who didn't want to interrupt. Snow dusted the windowsills, and clung to the edges of the roof. The hollow, now more teacher than experimenter, found himself speaking less, yet saying more. She didn't need his instruction as much now. She came to him for refinement, not permission. It was a strange thing to see a path you carved now walked by steadier feet, and stranger still to know she might surpass him. She didn't chase power. That's what made her dangerous in the best way. One morning, while cleaning shelves, she found an old diagram tucked inside a dusty volume of misfiled herbal references. It had no title. No notes. Just an etched circle filled with jagged lines, and a single eye at its center. "What's this?" she asked. He didn't recognize it, not immediately. But the longer he stared at it, the more it stirred memory. "This might be the one I never used," he murmured. She tilted her head. "Why?" "Because it wanted something back." "Back from you?" He looked up. "No, from someone else." She stared at the page a long while, then quietly slid it back into the book. That evening, she brewed a tea he didn't recognize, spiced with bark and black petals. When he tasted it, his chest tightened. Not painfully but sharply, like an echo of laughter from a memory he hadn't invited. She sipped hers without reaction. "You're stirring it again," he said, voice low. "The spiral." He nodded. "I don't think it ever stops," she replied. He paused. Then, "Have you dreamed lately?" "Yes." "Anything familiar?" "Yes," she said, "but they weren't sept dreams." He stilled. She didn't elaborate. Didn't need to. Instead, she asked, "What if someone else finishes what you started?" He stirred the fire. "They once did. Why?" "Because I didn't start it." She thought about that. The next morning, the owl returned. One of the original two, the small, frazzled one. It landed with an undignified thud, and immediately squawked at the tea she'd left cooling by the window. "Still steeping swamp water, I see." It rasped. She grinned. "You remember me?" "I remember everything," it muttered. Unfortunately, the hollow gave a slight bow. "Come to warn us again?" The owl fluffed its feathers. "No, just checking in." "Why now?" she asked. The owl looked past her, toward the hearth. "You cracked the mirror," it said. "Not many do that without going mad." She nodded once. It was time. The owl gave a low, gravelly noise. Approval, maybe, or indigestion. Then, from beneath its wing, it produced a single object, a folded piece of paper, yellowed and soft around the edges. It fluttered to the floor. She picked it up, unfolded it. Inside, her own sigil, drawn in charcoal. Dated 5 years from now. She looked at the hollow. He shook his head. "Not mine." The owl coughed. "It was passed back. By who?" The owl blinked slowly. She folded it again, set it on the table. "I'm not ready." "You're closer than you think," it replied. The owl didn't stay, didn't need to. It left through the door this time, not vanishing into air, not flitting into shadow. Just walked out. Clawed feet, clicking gently on stone. Later, the hollow said, "It came for you." She nodded. "It brought your echo." She said nothing. The fire crackled. The poppies outside had long since bowed to the frost. But some still stood. Thin, pale, defiant. She rose and fetched the red grimoire. He arched an eyebrow. "You sure?" She opened it. Its pages fluttered only a little. No screams, no shadows, no ink that bled upward. She placed it on the table, turned it to a page near the middle, one with no heading, just a blank page, except for a small mark in the corner, the shape of a circle with a keyhole in its center. He'd never seen that before. She touched it gently, and the page turned black. Not burned, not erased. Black, like space. Depth, without end. A moment later, it lightened. A single phrase appeared, handwritten in looping script. Neither of them had seen before. "We only finish when we forget why we started." She closed the book. The hollow leaned back. "Do you know why you started?" he asked. She looked toward the cellar door, then toward the poppy hill, and finally, at her own hands. "Yes," she said. And this time, she smiled. Not with victory, but with readiness. Snow came hard that night. Fat flakes, too large to drift. They thudded softly against the windows and gathered like whispers on the rooftop. By dawn, the forge was buried past its foundation, only the chimney visible from the eastern path. She turned to him and said, "It's time." He nodded. She wasn't asking for permission. She never had, not truly, but this was acknowledgement. The fifth strike wouldn't be repeated, it would be answered. He reached into the old wooden drawer beneath the bench and drew out the box, the one that once held the red clay. Now, it held something else. He handed it to her. She opened it carefully. Inside, a seed, smooth, heavy, the color of dried blood. It pulsed once as she touched it. "Is this it?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's yours." She blinked. "But what is it?" He exhaled. A question, shaped like a beginning. That evening, she walked into the cellar. He followed. The ripple in the air was still there, still faint, still open. She placed the seed in the center of the circle. It didn't roll. It settled as if claimed. He drew a line of chalk around it. She watched his hand. "You drew this for me," she said. "No," he replied. "You dreamed it." "I just remembered." The spiral was wide, gentle, welcoming. When she stepped into the circle, the forge above them didn't tremble. The earth didn't sigh. There were no voices, no sparks, no ghostly hands. Only silence. And in that silence, she closed her eyes. He watched, and she struck the floor with her staff. Once, no echo, no crack, just stillness. She looked up, the seed split. From within, not fire, not gold, but memory. Swirling threads of light rose into the air. Images, sounds, smells, a child's laughter, a cave of glass, a scream underwater, a page turning, a poppy opening, a stone pulsing. And her face, older, not older, impossible, smiling. The hollow stepped back. The cellar vanished. He was standing in the field again, but not the field of memory. This was now. Snow dusted the poppies, but they still stood, and in the center the girl. She looked down at her hands. Between them hovered the new stone. Not red, not gold, but white, clear, like quartz, except it shifted when not looked at. He approached slowly. "It worked," she whispered. "Yes, but it's not like yours." "No," he said. "It's better." She looked up at him. "You taught me how to hold it, but you never showed me how to use it." He smiled sadly. "No one can." She considered that. Then what now? He looked around, at the field, at the sky, at her. "I think," he said. "Now, you wait. And when the next one comes, you show them how not to forget." She caught it in both hands. It didn't hum. It breathed, and so did she. She sat in the field for hours, stone on her lap, as the snow piled around her. And when night fell, the poppies bloomed again. Bright red, under the full moon, unfrozen. Cold, patient. The girl, though she was no longer a girl, not truly rose from her blankets without urgency. Her limbs were warm from sleep, not stiff, and her breath came steady. She crossed the room, fed the fire with 3 sticks of ashwood, and waited for the flames to catch. They did, easily. No charm, no spark powder. Just fire, old and familiar. She placed the tea kettle above it, and as the water warmed, she stood by the window and looked out into the morning. It pulsed faintly, once every few seconds like a heartbeat at rest. She had not touched it since the seed opened. It had not asked for her, and she had not disturbed it. That was the agreement. You do not prod something that has already shown you its teeth. But today she would. The hollow was gone. Truly. There had been no sign of him, not even an echo of his boots across the floor or the smell of his tea. His chair remained by the hearth, empty. His coat still hung on the wall, sleeves limp, but he was not here. She'd said goodbye when the poppies bloomed red again. That had been the sign. Still, she wished just a little, that he'd appear now. Just for a moment. Just to say, "Yes, you're ready." But maybe she didn't need him to say it anymore. She poured the tea, drank it in silence, and dressed in the robe she'd sewn herself from old linens and waxed canvas. It was functional, but etched faintly at the hem with her sigil, spiraling outward, drawn not in ink, but stitched with thread, soaked in poppy dye, and dried over coals. She wore it like armor, not to protect, but to remember. The stone waited on the table. She picked it up. It didn't flare or resist. It rose easily into her hands, warm and pulsing, heavy, but not oppressively so, like a full thought, or a memory so strong it weighs the body down. She carried it outside. The air bit at her skin, but the stone dulled the cold. She walked the path through the snow, each footstep precise. The trail behind her vanished with the wind, but she never looked back. At the center of the poppy field, the circle remained. It had not been carved, not etched or dug. It had simply formed, a clearing, round and perfect, where the snow would not fall and the wind would not enter. The poppies leaned outward, creating a living border of red. She stepped inside. The stone pulsed faster now, once, twice, 3 times, and then settled into silence. She placed it on the ground before her, right at the center, and knelt. Her hands hovered just above it. And she waited, for the wind, for the voice, for the echo. Instead, she heard nothing, not even the beat of her own heart. The world had gone completely still. Then, one breath. Not hers, not the wind, something beneath her. The earth exhaled, and the stone cracked. Not violently, not like before, a gentle, necessary parting. A line from top to bottom, not broken, opened. From the fissure, light spilled out, not blinding, soft, like firelight behind curtains. Inside the stone there was no core, no gem, no metal, just images. She saw herself, but younger, alone, wandering. She saw her brother, eyes wide, laughing in snow, slipping through ice, vanishing in silence. She saw her mother's hands in a field of wheat. She saw the hollow at the hearth, asleep upright, quill still in hand. She saw the field, the mirror, the hammer. She saw every strike, every gate, and then she saw beyond. The spiral stretched past her sight. Other faces, other hands, one holding the original stone red and wild, pulsing in a world made of fire and salt, another holding a blackened shard inside a cave of mirrors, one smiling, one weeping, one whispering her name, and then, nothing, no visions, just her, and the stone, and a question. It came without sound, without force, just clarity. "Do you remember why you came?" She didn't hesitate. She answered, "To carry it forward." The stone pulsed once more, then the light faded, and it closed, whole again, no longer humming, just there. She picked it up, and as she rose to her feet, the snow began to fall again, light, clean, drifting down like the sky had finally remembered how to breathe. She left the circle. The poppies bowed gently as she passed. Back inside the forge, she placed the stone in the hearth, not into the flames but onto the ashes. And for the first time since she arrived, she rested. She slept in the hollow's chair, and the world turned quietly. Days passed, then weeks. The weather warmed. Frost lifted. The hills greened. One morning, while gathering herbs at the edge of the grove, she saw someone watching her, a child, no older than she had been when she'd first seen the door between dreams and memory. The child said nothing, just held up a piece of charcoal and a slip of torn parchment. On it, a spiral. Hers. The child vanished soon after, but the parchment remained. She placed it in the ledger beneath her own sigil, writing only one word beside it, begin. And so, it would. Again, and again. Not the same story, but the same remembrance. She never saw the hollow again. Not in the mirror. Not in dreams. But sometimes, when the wind passed just right through the forge, she could smell his tea. And sometimes, when she opened her ledger, she found a single red petal pressed between the pages. She taught, eventually, only a few, never too many. She didn't call it alchemy. She didn't give it a name. She simply showed them how to listen, how to sit still, how to remember. The stone, now dull as clay, sat on a small shelf beside a bowl of dried flowers. No one touched it, not even her, but all who saw it felt the pull, the weight, the invitation. They never asked what it was. They already knew. The final page of her ledger was left blank. No instructions, no marks, only a handprint, pressed in ash, waiting, just in case someone needed to know. Someone had been here before. And if you stood in the poppy field on a night when the wind was silent and the sky held its breath, you might see them just shadows, just outlines. The girl, the stone, and the gate. Never closed, just patient. The forge is quiet now, not because it is empty, but because it is full of breath and warmth, and the hush of something finished well. The kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled, because it's already whole. The kind of silence that rests on the skin like snowfall, cool, but never cold. The stone still rests by the hearth. It doesn't hum, or glow, or pulse, with unknown hunger. It simply sits, content to be. Sometimes, in the fading light, its surface catches the fire's reflection and flickers with memories, not grand visions, not magical storms, just shadows and warmth. A hand placed on a shoulder, a page turning, a kettle boiling, a laugh stifled by a sleeve, the little things that mattered more than gold ever could. The woman, no longer apprentice, no longer seeker, sits near the fire, not with books, not with scrolls, just tea and the sound of the logs shifting quietly in the embers. Her hair has grown longer. Her robe is patched now, but she still wears it with care. She doesn't speak much anymore, not because she has nothing to say, but because those who come now, they're ready to listen without words. The spiral still turns, slowly, patiently, like the turning of seasons or the exhale after a long-held breath. And beyond the forge, in the field where poppies bloom even when the snow falls, the circle remains. Nothing marks it, nothing encloses it. It's just there, as if the earth itself remembers something sacred happened there, and still might again. You, listener, might be wondering now, was it real? The stone, the fifth strike, the whispers beneath the floor, the mirror that showed more than reflection, the owl who spoke in riddles and recipes. Maybe those parts seem like dreams, or metaphors, or nonsense. But here's a small truth most alchemists never wrote down. Magic doesn't always want to be understood. Sometimes, it just wants to be witnessed. Sometimes, all that matters is that someone saw, and you, quiet listener, you saw. You followed the spiral, all the way to its center. You heard the breathless silence between the pulses. You stood still with the girl, now woman, when she first held the stone without needing it to become anything more than what it was. So, even now, you carry it. Maybe not in your hands, but in your thoughts, in your quiet. Maybe, or maybe the story ended where it should. Right here in the gentle hush of completion. Because not all stories are meant to spin forever. Some are meant to settle, like coals beneath a kettle, warm long after the flames go out. You can breathe now. In, hold, out. You've followed the rhythm long enough. The echoes have faded, not into forgetting, but into rest. There's no gate to hold open tonight. No ghosts to speak with, no riddle to solve, just the low hum of contentment, and the softness of knowing you stayed long enough to witness what so many missed. A stone that didn't shatter, a girl who didn't give up, a fire that never demanded more than it gave, and you, still here, just listening. The snow is soft outside now. The wind, barely a sigh against the shutters, the kind of wind that pulls your blanket higher and slows your thoughts without asking permission. You don't need to chase the story anymore. It's finished running. The poppies sleep too, their red petals folding gently beneath the stars, not with sadness but peace. They know the work is done. The stone sleeps, and maybe now, so should you. So let your eyes drift closed. Let the silence wrap around you like that waxed canvas robe, lined in threads of memory. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the forge's hearth, steady and low. And if you dream tonight, if something pulls at the edge of your mind, you might just find yourself walking a path you don't quite remember, a hill covered in frost-kissed red, a door without hinges, a spiral drawn in snow. Don't be afraid. It's not a test. It's a memory. Yours now. Because the stone wasn't made to be owned. It was made to be remembered. So, sleep, soft-hearted listener. You've come far, you've stayed long, you've listened well, and the spiral, it thanks you, even now. Good night, little seeker. Dream well.